to this, our first GeoFutures roundtable on the subject of land management. And I envisage that we'll have more such roundtables in the future to talk about our GeoFuture. But first I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to say that we're on the unceded and occupied territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish nations, and thank them for that, for this ability to be on this land, even though it's unceded. And then I want to introduce each of our panel members. So I'm going to start by introducing Naomi Schwartz, who is our visitor here from UBC, and her research is centered on extreme events in tropical forest landscapes. And to study these environments, Naomi looks at ways that climate change and land use are already affecting these environments and asking which forests will be most vulnerable to this kind of event. And also, what are the underlying spatial processes that lead to differences in how some forests respond to disturbances and climate extremes? And what I found really interesting looking at your website is that she and her students are using both qualitative and quantitative methods, and as well as mapping to answer these questions. So I think that's a unique instance of mixed methods in basically physical geography. Bing he's a professor here in geography, and he's a remote sensing and environment expert, and he investigates how environmental change affects ecosystems. And he uses a range, come on in, it's all good, a range of remote sensing equipment and data to do this, and his research focuses particularly on grasslands and wetlands, which are very sensitive to environmental change and subsequent loss of ecosystem function. And his research also supports agriculture, which is important to us all, and also being challenged by pollution, crop disease, and of course climate change. Jesse Hahm is a hydrologist here in the Department of Geography at SQ, and his focus is that on tree canopies and bedrock, which is kind of a really interesting combination, because they're both, as he says, key to life. But the subsurface structure and water dynamics, of course, affects trees. And he joins these two areas of research by investigating how bedrock water flows to plants. This is, of course, really important under the regime of climate change. And his researchers, his grad students, use a whole bunch of tools to try and figure out these complex relationships, including remote sensing, drilling, chemical analysis. Yeah. So thank you to our guests. We're going to start with just a brief presentation about each of our guests' research, starting with Naomi and then Bing and then Jesse. But I just want to introduce a paradigm that Naomi gave me, which I stole for this purpose, which is that there are really three aspects to land management. One is a technological aspect. What are the tools we're using? One is a policy context. What are government and industrial policies in response to certain climate change and various things, and what policies do they develop? And then there's what do individual citizens do? Like, for example, how are individual citizens incorporating new fire management practices in response to wildfire threats? So those are sort of three ways that we can look at land management. Please begin, Naomi.
Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm embarrassed to say I've been here for 5 years, and this is my first time on this beautiful campus, so I'm glad I get to face this way a little bit and take in really nice views. You asked me to give about a 5 to 7 minute overview of things we do in my lab group, so I will do that, mostly in photographic form. So in my lab at UBC Geography, I work with a bunch of students and other collaborators, mostly on the ecology of complex landscapes, and mostly in the tropics. So what do I mean by complex landscapes? So here's two examples. So, is this a pointer, or is this just a slide clicker?
Yeah, clicker.
Oh, not a pointer. Okay, I'll just stand up and gesture. How's that? Okay. So what do I mean by a complex landscape? So here's one example. So on the left, this is a screen capture from Google Earth over a region I've done some work in Peru. And you can see that, so if there's a road, there's been lots of deforestation around this road. There are some oil palm plantations, there's some old growth forests, there's also some younger forest patches that are brighter in color, that are regrowing after clearing. So there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity, and a lot of different types of land use going on, and a lot of interactions sort of across this matrix. And then on the right, this is another example of a complex landscape. So this is, I'm working recently in Southeast Asian forest savanna mosaics, and so this is an ortho photo from a region in here, Cambodia. And we've been working, so you can see the savanna with the open tree cover. It's the dry season, and so the grasses are mostly dead, so it's kind of brown in the background. And they exist in these very patchy mosaics with more closed canopy forest. And so, what determines the spatial distribution of these two vegetation types, and how might they change in the future? So that's sort of an overview of the kinds of places that I work in. In landscapes like these, as I mentioned, there's a lot of second growth forest. Second growth forest is forest regenerating after some sort of disturbance or clearing. Second growth forests in the tropics, they can regenerate from post-disturbance quite quickly. Natural regeneration works as well. And as deforestation slows in the tropics, there's a lot of hope that tropical reforestation, forest restoration, will make big contributions to climate change mitigation. So of course, forests store lots of biomass in their, lots of carbon in their biomass. And so there's this big hope, a lot of optimism about the potential for second growth forests in the tropics to contribute to climate change mitigation, and also to provide other ecosystem services like habitat for biodiversity and other things. And so one of the themes that we focused on in my lab group is how much will second growth forests actually contribute to climate change mitigation. And so we've done this by working in big collaborations, pan-tropical syntheses, to try to understand how much carbon what's the upper limit on how much carbon tropical second growth forests could store, how fast do they regenerate, how fast do they take up carbon, how biodiversity and other ecosystem services change as forests regenerate, and what are the factors that explain differences across big regional differences in how forests regenerate. This is also meant asking, given the land use dynamics in these very complex landscapes, what are the odds that we can actually count on tropical forests to persist and be permanent, which is an obvious precursor for storing carbon and contributing to biodiversity conservation. So I thought I should include one map. The rest are all photos, but including one map. So this is a study we did using a 25-year time series of land cover data across Latin America and the Caribbean, all of the humid and dry tropical forest biome. We basically asked, how is forest cover changing in each of these regions? Is it relatively stable? Is there deforestation? Are there deforestation reversals or reforestation reversals? So is forest cover increasing? Or how often have we seen some reforestation, some increases in forest cover, followed by a later reversal? We found that there's actually a lot of reversals. I've done some other studies at different scales to sort of better understand these dynamics, but what we've found in a general sense is that tropical second growth forests are not nearly as permanent as we need them to be if we want them to make a big contribution to climate change mitigation. I have no idea how I am on time, so just cut me off if I go on too long. Okay. Right, so we also asked questions about how spatial context influences vulnerability to extreme events. So how does where a forest is, the land use history of that particular forest, so is it a second growth forest, how old is it old growth, the degree of fragmentation, the types of land use around forests, how does that influence vulnerability to extremes such as fires, wind damage, drought, etc. And we focus mostly on impacts of fragmentation and forest age, but also on whether we can use some of the qualitative or more socioeconomic data we were talking about. We've also worked to understand whether landowner demographics and demographic shifts in the rural Amazon can influence the likelihood of fire on particular land parcels. So how does the characteristics of the landowners influence fire on their parcels. Right, so this is a photo, moving on to some of the work in Southeast Asia. This is a photo of a deciduous dipterocarp savanna in Southeast Asia. So it exists on the sort of wet end of where the savanna biome exists in the tropics. But it's got a fairly open canopy, a continuous grassy understory. There's some argument going on about whether it should be classified as a forest or a savanna. I won't go into that, but if you are interested in that sort of semantic argument, I'd be happy to talk about it. I'm on Team Savanna. It really functions like a savanna with frequent fire, open canopy, etc. Anyways, that's a slight aside. But right, these savannas exist, as I mentioned earlier, in these patchy mosaic landscapes with a closed canopy forest. And so that's also relatively unique for savannas in the tropics. They tend to be present more commonly in sort of broader expanses, so this is a quite patchy landscape, and this is just a photo of the boundaries, so you can see how abrupt those transitions are in space. And so we're working on understanding what maintains forest savanna boundaries and how might they shift in the future. And so, there's sort of a few competing hypotheses. One is that forest savanna boundaries are influenced by differences in soil characteristics or hydrology or some other sort of abiotic factors. And then a second hypothesis that feedbacks between fire and vegetation maintain the boundary between forest and savanna. And so that works so the grassy understory during the dry season is more likely to burn. The trees in the savanna are very adapted to fire and don't die when there's fire. The closed canopy in the forest and the lack of a grassy fuel layer excludes fire, or at least that's the hypothesis. So we're testing those different hypotheses in this landscape. So we've done some work using remote sensing, satellite remote sensing at really broad scales to understand the spatial patterns of forest and savanna across the region. We've also been connecting that with more sort of in situ remote sensing. I'll show some images from that on the next slide. And also some field work to then understand, and I also wanted to mention some using historic air photos and satellite images from the Corona satellites, so those old spy satellites in the 60s. We're using images from those sources to understand also how stable the boundaries are through time. I guess I didn't mention that this is a very poorly understood landscape, so it's really interesting for all the reasons I mentioned, but it's also not well understood and very important for conservation and biodiversity in the region. What's our approach? So I mentioned we use a lot of satellite remote sensing to understand patterns at broad scale, so that might mean using satellites to map impacts of drought across heterogeneous landscapes, and then using those maps to understand what explains variation in those impacts. We also use some in-situ remote sensing, so this is a student, one of my students and myself in the field, this is a terrestrial laser scanner. This is an example of the cool data that we generated with the terrestrial laser scanner, so it creates this really detailed picture of forest structure, and so we're using that to understand impacts of fire suppression in the savanna to try to tease apart what the role of fire is. And then we do a lot of field work as well to try to understand the ecological dynamics in a little bit more. Okay, I have one more slide. I wanted to just give a little, this is something I'm working on at UBC that I'm super proud of, and it's a new initiative at UBC, so I wanted to give it a little shout out because also I think there's opportunities for sort of cross-campus exchange and collaboration. So I've been involved in the leadership of the Interdisciplinary Biodiversity Solutions Collaboratory. So our vision, this is from our strategic plan, is collaborative science to advance just, equitable, and inclusive interdisciplinary solutions for biodiversity and people to thrive. So iBios, it's a group of faculty members from all over the university, so from Faculty of Science, Faculty of Arts, Forestry, etc., who are all interested in developing new solutions to address the biodiversity crisis, kind of saying the status quo of conservation, there are definitely some success stories, but there's also a lot of cases where it's not working. So how can we work as an interdisciplinary team and in a way that really engages with communities to develop new solutions that hopefully work better for biodiversity, but also acknowledging the sort of historic injustices and harms that have come with the sort of traditional approaches to conservation. Can we innovate new ways to do conservation that are more just and more equitable and inclusive. So with that, I'll stop. I hope I didn't go on too long. But I wanted to also just give a shout out to my lab group and funding sources. I have really amazing students, and they've done a lot of the work I've talked about. They've really taken a leadership role on. So, okay, thank you.
So I just finished teaching for 2 hours in the morning. Thanks to the coffee, I have no energy right now. Yeah, so my research around evaluating ecosystem health and the impacts of environmental change using remote sensing. So different remote sensing technologies used in my research, such as shown here, satellites, drones, helicopters. So they provide data with different spatial resolutions, temporal resolutions that are suitable for different purposes. So I use these different remote sensing technologies to investigate ecosystem health and environmental change. So there are so many ecosystems, so forest, grasslands, wetlands, and also croplands. My research focused on these 3 ecosystems, so agriculture, coast, and the grassland, wetland. So in the next few slides, I will introduce 2 projects I have been working on in the recent years. How I use remote sensing to evaluate ecosystem health. So first, agriculture. So investigating blueberry storage virus infection. So if you are from Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, if we talk about agriculture, you will see the large acre farm fields, soybeans, so corns. But here in BC, when we talk about agriculture, we must think about specialty crops such as berries. So for this project, I want to use remote sensing to evaluate the health of the blueberry. So in recent decades, there's one virus or disease named scorch, and it really influences the growth of plants and also the yield. So here, the top 3 photos, this one showing healthy bush, and here showing the infected bush. So you can see the discoloration and also the bulb of the leaf. So here you can see the brown colored leaf. So these are the infection signals of the scorch virus. So something annoying is this virus can spread from one plant to another plant. So let's say in one field. So it can easily spread where the aphids and the wet from one infected plant to a healthy plant, and eventually the entire farm can be infected. So that being said, it can also spread from one field to another field, one farm to another farm. So this virus was first found in early 2000, but after 20 years, ran off all over the province. So it's really big concern in the industry. So we want to, let's say, map the location of different infected plants. Let's say in this farm, maybe only 10% infected. Another farm, maybe 20% or 50% infected. So if we have such percentage or quantitative description of the infection level, and then the industry or the growers, they have more information to do corresponding management. So to detect the infection of the plants, so we can do field surveys. So let's say just shown in the photo. So we label the infected plants in on ground. So that's global. However, if we want to investigate really the infection for large farm or maybe for a region, it's not possible. So it's really fun to do the, let's say, the picking blueberries in the growing season with our family. That's really lots of fun. However, for the field survey, that's totally not the case. So lots of work. It's labor intensive, tedious, so and also hot for sure. So just walking one row, another row, that's not an easy thing. So challenging for field work, but if with the remote sensing drones or maybe satellites, we can map the area like relatively easily, and then we can do spatial and temporal analysis. Spatially, let's say with one image, we can see the distribution pattern. Maybe more infection in this column and less infection in another column. So that's what we can do, the spatial. And also the temporal, we have one image from 5 years ago, another image 2 years ago, and one image this year, and we can track the temporal change. So let's say 5 years ago, maybe only 10% infection, and after 5 years, and then maybe 20%. that's a clear indication of the spread of the virus, which is a big issue. And then the industry, the growers, they deal with that, otherwise their yield will just drop. And then we collected the drone data in our study area in panelists, so we can clearly see different rows. So this is a more detailed view, this is more broad view. And then the modern part quickly show our results by postdoc in my group. So the image on the left, that's the image collected. So with the training data shown by each point. And then this is the mapping result. The yellow color indicates infected, green color indicates healthy. So we can see the distribution pattern for the infection and also the percentage. So this is one project. Another project I would like to quickly introduce is my coastal research, one of my favorite. So about the marsh extent and also vegetation composition. So here, that's the east south coast. For sure, the marsh area, that's really valuable ecosystem, provide habitats to the wildlife and ecosystem service for the human society. However, in the past few decades, because of climate change and human activities, the marsh extent has been decreasing. So this study shows from the 1989 to 2011, so the marsh boundary can retreated 400 to 500 meters. That's a lot. We lost really large areas of marsh, big issue. So one kind limitation for this study, we only use like 2 years data. So for my research, I want to collect the data for every year, and then we can map which areas we have lost more marsh, which areas we have lost less. So how fast the marsh can be lost or died off, and then we have better ideas. So using limited resource, which areas we should put more resources for the conservation, which areas less concerning, and we can put less resources for that area. So that's the motivation for this project. So here, just quickly show some of the marsh extent mapping result because of time. The one on the left, that's a satellite image. And on the right, so that's the mapping result by my PhD Doris. So using remote sensing technique to map the vegetation area to indicate distribution for the marsh. So this is for 1 year. If we have another map for other years, and then we can see the spatial and temporal change of the marsh. So another topic in the coastal research I want to focus on is vegetation composition. So different vegetation communities or different vegetation species. So as we can see from these fieldwork photos, so some species vegetation communities very tall, some very short. Some areas very colorful, but some areas just bare mud. So there will be some invasive species, some native species. So they have different influence on ecosystem health. So we want to, let's say, map these invasive species areas, and then the industry or the government, they can deal with these invasive species. So that's why we want to map the species and community distribution. So here, from the satellite image, so if we zoom in, we can clearly see different colors, different textures, so indicating the composition of different communities, species. So that shows the potential of satellite image to map the communities and also species. So here are some results. So one study by my postdoc Ali. So this is for the part of the south coast. Different colors indicating different dominant species. Some are invasive, some are native species. So with such a map, we can clearly see the spatial pattern of species composition. So how many species in one area? Maybe this is the dominant species. Other areas, there will be another dominant species. So it can also support our control of the invasive species. So rather than like just going to the field, which is really challenging to find the invasive species, but using such a map, we can easily see where the invasive species are and how large it is, and then we can focus our efforts to control invasive species for these areas. Okay, so the last slide. So quickly connect to our roundtable today. So showing the future of the technology. So remote sensing has been used in the past few decades. So from 1930s using more airplane air photos, and then satellites from 1960s, 70s, and in recent years the UAVs so popular. And in the future, so we will kind of go to the remote sensing big data. So everyone will have kind of easier access to these different types of data. So different spatial resolution, different technology, LiDAR, thermal, so radar. And then it will be the different layers available, so these are different data sets. So the challenging part is how we can convert the image to information. So that's important. We have lots of image, but how we can extract information we need. So no matter vegetation information or the marsh information, so we need information. Remote sensing image, we can extract different features. So transportation, soil, topography, hydrology, temperature, these different features from the image. And then in the future, likely we can use AI to analyze all these features like in a comprehensive way to better understand like a bigger and complete picture of what's going on the ground, so the ecosystem health, so the associated ecological process, geomorphological process. So the change is one thing. More important thing is how the change happens. Any ecological, geomorphological process series behind the change, and then this series, the knowledge will help us to better manage the ecological and geomorphological change. Okay, so that's my research.
All right. Hi. So I am Jesse. I'm representing the hydrology research group here in the geography department, and I thought I would start with some of the things that motivate and contextualize the work that I do. So, for example, a few years ago we experienced a heat dome here in the Pacific Northwest, one of the hottest summers ever recorded. And this was almost immediately followed in October by a series of atmospheric rivers that destroyed infrastructure throughout the province. So this drought to deluge, or weather whiplash, is becoming increasingly common along the west coast of North America. It results in extremely expensive infrastructure problems, things, almost semi-comical things like the barge crashing into the shore here in Vancouver. This past summer, we experienced the most wildfires in BC ever on record, and throughout Canada, actually, there were fires in the east as well. And this resulted in wholesale evacuation of entire cities. For example, the city of Illinois and much of Kelowna this past summer. And the future looks to hold more of these things, so we expect it to be warmer, more extreme dry seasons, more extreme wet seasons. And so all in all, how are these things impacting the hydrologic cycle? Can we predict and mitigate their impacts on our bioinfrastructure and ecosystems? That's sort of the milieu that I am thinking about. And just to preview this current winter, by the way, the snowpack is currently around below the 10th percentile, and this doesn't include this past weekend's heat wave. So I suspect it might get back to where it's the lowest ever recorded in the province. Last year with the fires, we were actually at the median, and it heated up so quickly that by the end of the meltdown period, we were also in one of the driest possible periods. So these are very concerning things. Some impacts on ecosystems are, for example, widespread forest mortality. Currently, the best climate and physiological predictions do a very poor job of predicting when, why, and which trees will actually die during drought. So this is sort of the background. I'm here to tell you, to try to sell you on the idea that looking below ground is actually important for understanding a lot of ecosystem response to these processes, and particularly looking into below the soil, where in various rock outcrops, if you drive around here and look at outcrops, or if you look at from the ferry, you will see forests mantled on very thin soil with their roots extending into underlying weathered bedrock. This has traditionally been the unmeasured zone. It's really hard to access, so partly because of difficulty in getting down there, we have not studied this very much, but we have a lot of evidence that it should probably be important. So the sort of overall hypothesis that our group is working on is that this bedrock that's underneath hill slopes strongly couples the atmosphere to the solid earth via water and carbon cycling. And so we're interested in asking, how does that zone mediate water and carbon fluxes between the atmosphere and streams, and how does it mediate the dynamics of runoff? I'm just going to close this little alert so that it doesn't block the screen. I think it's going to say that I can't play video later. It's okay. And one of our sayings is that plants connect solid earth to its atmosphere. So some of the things we're interested in is how much respiration is happening deep below ground, how much carbon are trees sending down to their roots, and how much is returning to the atmosphere versus ending up in groundwater and leading to streams. And to what extent are plants also drawing water out of this zone and sending it back to the atmosphere instead of letting it drain down into streams? And does this determine their susceptibility in drought? The approaches that we take span spatial scales. We have a lot of intensively monitored field sites where we go out and we do deep drilling to get down into the ground, putting out data loggers, connecting sensors. This is kind of a visual representation of just how deep these boreholes are when we're putting infrastructure down there. This one has a bunch of gas tubes at different depths to slurp up the atmosphere in the subsurface and see how much carbon dioxide is in it on the surface. And the data that we generate, this is sort of a recent example, carbon dioxide profiles as a function of depth down to about 30 feet below ground. It's lethal. Like if you were living down there, you would asphyxiate. It's something I didn't know before studying this deeper stuff. And the fact that the concentration is high here and slopes upwards implies that there's a flux going upwards, right? Gas goes from high concentration to low concentration. So trees are injecting carbon deep into the subsurface, and it's going back to the atmosphere, and some of it's also probably dissolving in groundwater and leaving in the streams, and so we're trying to better understand that. And then spanning up to spatial scales, we can't drill everywhere, so trying to leverage remotely sensed data sets to make some claims about how widespread these phenomena happen to be. One quick example of an applied case study, how this relates to actual management questions, is that a few years ago there was a snowpack that did not produce stream flow. And this is extremely concerning, right? Managers typically go out this time of year, look at the snowpack to make forecasts about how much will end up in water reservoirs. And this was what the data looked like. The snowpack was actually at the 40th percentile, but the historic relationship between snowpack and stream flow broke that particular year. It's an example of non-stationarity in the climate system. And one of the things that we've discovered that we think explains what was happening here was that there was basically unprecedented mining by plant roots of moisture deeper and deeper into the subsurface in the drought years that preceded this event, such that when the snow melted, it went to replenishing that deeper storage instead of draining out and ending up in the streams. Then I'm going to just skip this one for the sake of time, but another side interest of our research group is trying to understand how and why wetted channel networks expand and contract in stream networks and how that will change under different climate scenarios. And this is important for predicting aquatic ecosystem habitat and understanding various other services that are provided by wetted channel networks. So with that, I will thank some of these core members of my group and funding agencies and segue into the panel discussion.
How does your subspecialty of research talk about the future in 5, 10, or even 20 years? What are people saying about the future?
Sure, I can start. So I'm so happy to see remote sensing is used in those Naomi and Jesse research. So that's great. So I mean, remote sensing is so helpful. So no matter you are human geographer, physical geographer, environmental scientist, so we can always use remote sensing to some extent for your research. So in the next 5 to 20 years, I will see the application will be easier and easier. So right now, there are so many barriers in the remote sensing application. So you will need to download data from somewhere, and you will need the software technique to analyze image and then get the information you need. So right now, so because the AI is so powerful, so it can download image automatically and then track information you need. So with the development of the AI technique, so in the future, so hopefully, let's say if you can just give a demand to ChatGPT or another AI machine and say, I want park information for Vancouver, and then the AI will download image and then analyze image, give you the information. So you just give a demand. So that's something I would expect. So it will remove barriers efficiently and make the research and also application way easier. So that's my hope.
Sure. Yeah, I guess, yeah, so that thing, I think you sort of covered some of what I would think about in terms of like the technological aspect of what the future holds, which I think is sort of, yeah, lots more machine learning, AI, more remote sensing, more data, and then hopefully better models using all of the additional data and information that we have, because Jesse, I mean, you touched on this also, how, you know, our best models are really bad at predicting when and where trees will die from drought, for example. And so I think there's still there's so much uncertainty. So thinking about in terms of what, you know, what are predictions for 5 or 20 or even 100 years out, I think that's really the only generality I can make is that there's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things that we don't understand and a lot of surprises. And so, yeah, I guess there's a hope that this additional data will bring additional insight.
Yeah.
I guess I was going to say a few things. One thing that people in my field are saying in the context of land management locally is that the bad news is that much of our water infrastructure was planned around snowpacks. And as snowpacks are turning to rain in the winter, it's harder to keep that storage later into summer. The good news is that over the past few decades, for example, in Metro Vancouver, our population growth has exploded and we have not run out of water. And the reason is that we're much more efficient users of water. And I would say that we're still wasting a ton. And so before we locally really feel the pinch, there's many, many efficiency measures that could be applied locally before we have to invest billions of dollars in building new reservoirs or treatment centers or something. That's one management thing. The other sort of provocative hypothesis that people are putting forward in hydrology is that process-based models are the thing of the past, and machine learning is the thing of the future. And so people that like to get a rise out of other people say, like, why are you still doing any process-based modeling? All of our future efforts should be machine learning because of the sheer accuracy improvements that are in that. And there's lots of critiques of that, and that I would say is an ongoing debate in the community. And then the one other thing I was thinking about was fire deficits in the context of land management in Western North America. So like the wholesale fire suppression and cessation of indigenous burning has resulted in a huge amount of forest that over the past millennia would have already burned, but now has been building up and building up and building up. And at the same time, we have inhabited the wildland-urban interface. Almost all of British Columbia is in the wildland-urban interface, and so it's really hard to do the controlled burns that would be necessary to get back to status quo. And that's like the future hard sell conversation that politicians have to have with people, is that we must start doing more controlled burns, even if some of them get out of hand. Like, we can't have zero risk tolerance for controlled burns if we want to get back to a manageable state. And that's maybe another provocative idea that people put forward. And I was curious to see what people's thoughts were about.
Those are really interesting insights, and it really leads to the next question, which is what could affect the near future in land management? So what are some of the scenarios that could really affect changes in land management? Jesse, you almost touched on one there.
Yeah, like I don't know like how much more of a wake-up call we would need after last summer.
Right?
Like risks of fire encroaching on us. Like maybe it's still too distant for us here in Metro Vancouver. But like a large fire on the North Shore, for example, would force hard conversations about what to do, I think. I don't know. or in my neighborhood. Also in the wildland-urban interface.
Well, as you said, almost everywhere is in the wildland-urban interface. Are there other, events that could affect land management in the near future? And does Ding or Naomi have anything to say about the fire threat, which is super real?
Yeah, so one topic Jesse just mentioned is the kind of the difference or the connection between machine learning and also process-based models. So yes, it's more and more popular to use machine learning because it's robust and also the accuracy is quite good. So, but I also see the process-based models is more complicated for sure, but that's built based on the physical laws, based on our knowledge. So it's still valuable to continue working on such process-based models because such model will give us more understanding, knowledge of the process involved. But machine learning, deep learning, they are more like a black box. So they give you good results, but not necessarily kind of real knowledge we need. And also talk about the land management. For sure, the remote sensing image and also models are needed to monitor the land, such as the distribution of different land covers. So distribution and also health of the forest, grassland areas, wetland areas. So over the years, with more and more remote sensing data accumulation, and then we have better understanding the historical change of the land. So in the past 10 years, 50 years, how for what areas, maybe a mountain area, maybe another cropland area, how it changed in the past few years. Only with such long-term observation, and then we can have better understanding the process and also the knowledge involved. With a short-time observation study is not possible. So remote sensing and also the long-term data accumulation is so critical for better understanding the land change, and also such findings and knowledge will be helpful for the future management.
Yeah, so I guess I have a few comments about sort of future fire regimes. And the part of where I work in Southeast Asia, fire regimes are really disrupted also through fire suppression. But the motivation, it's fire suppression is well, it's not necessarily just a contemporary phenomenon, but there's a new motivation, which is carbon markets. So there's a lot of, so if you suppress fire in the savanna within about 10 to 15 years, there's really intense woody encroachment. So trees, woody plants invade the understory, and you store a lot more carbon above ground. And that of course has issues with biodiversity, and also, these savannas are sort of important ecosystems for local communities that have sort of traditional land use practices in those areas. And I guess I think a lot about the influence of this global trend in prioritizing carbon above other things, and this focus on how much we're depending on natural systems, and especially tropical forests, to sort of take up carbon from the atmosphere because we haven't been able to reduce our emissions quickly enough. And so I guess I think a lot of what plays out in those sorts of systems and in tropical landscapes will have something to do with what our attitudes and approaches are to carbon offsetting, to RED projects, to and then of course I think we're trying to understand what the feedbacks are with fire suppression and fire risk. Do we see similar increases in fire risk, or what is the trajectory in terms of fire risk and the negative impacts of fire on people with fire suppression? It's a different sort of ecological trajectory than you see here. I don't think it's a sort of steady increase in risk with time. I think it sort of increases and then declines, but we're kind of testing that hypothesis right now, so stay tuned. But yeah, I think how much we end up really focusing on carbon above other things will also include the next few years.
I think there's some really interesting issues raised there, for example, how much risk in terms of prescribed burns are we willing to sustain? Why do we have this emphasis on carbon offset against all other areas of environmental management? And then, Bing raised the point, again, Jesse had initially raised about the use of process-based models versus AI or machine-generated machine learning. And I just want to throw in this thing that I always always say, which is, all models are wrong. So that was originally said, I think, by mathematician George Fox. But so, are there ways that each of you can imagine different efforts combining in new or fruitful ways to mitigate these various threats to life on the planet?
So I see the collaboration, the interdisciplinary collaboration is so important. I really like the idea that Naomi just mentioned. So interdisciplinary biodiversity solution collaboration. So right now, let's say in the agriculture field, different agriculture professors, researchers have their own research topics. So then they collaborate with industry, collaborate with government for that small piece research. However, the government, the policymakers, they need more comprehensive, more complete information to make the most reliable or smart decisions. So they need to collaborate with a range of scientists, professors from different backgrounds. So in the, let's say right now, there are some research collaborations, research groups with funding from government or from some other source to support research for a few years. So let's say 3 years, 5 years, but after 5 years, and then people work on their own research again. So I would say if it's possible, if there is guaranteed funding to support interdisciplinary collaboration research for long term, and each researcher will have guaranteed time to dedicate on this collaboration, no matter on fire or biodiversity, and then they can all contribute with their own technology, with their own expertise to provide more complete information for the policymakers to control the fire, to develop more efficient strategies to deal with the fire and the damages. So that would be more useful than kind of piece by piece research here and there.
Well, Jesse, I feel like when I met you a few years ago, you were one of the many people who reminded me that I need to look below ground. I'm very much above ground focused, or have been traditionally. I think part of that is remote sensing. Using remote sensing kind of forces an above ground focus, because that's what you can see from above ground, although you seem to be using remote sensing to infer some things about below ground. I think there's a lot of exciting new frontiers using remote sensing to infer below ground processes. But I think, yeah, it's a good reminder, and I think that and also integrating the hydrological system with sort of ecology, landscape dynamics, land use change, that's also probably what the future, I hope, would hold. But I agree with you being that there needs to be more support for interdisciplinary research. Like, our NSERC is so individualistic. We're funded for individual discovery grants just for my lab, and doesn't really have, say much about collaboration or the value of collaboration. I think we need more support for that kind of work to do it well. And I also think geography departments are great places for that sort of thing to happen. So.
Yeah, we need more funding for our department.
I think things are something interesting too about longer-term funding, not just these little pockets that end and then so something. Jesse, do you have something to say about?
I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe not.
So finally, how have you and your colleagues and your teams, people that you work with, how have you been thinking about the issue of Indigenous redress and land-based sovereignty and the work that you do, each of you individually?
Yeah, that question is why I wanted to include to highlight the work that iBios is doing, because I think iBios, one of the goals is really to approach conservation from a different way that puts sort of Indigenous sovereignty more front and center. There's been so much research over the last few years showing that conservation outcomes are better when land management is left to Indigenous people. Deforestation rates are lower on Indigenous lands globally, even when you're sort of controlling for underlying differences in what lands are controlled by Indigenous people or not. And so, you know, and also it's the right thing to do, but also I think that like the future of conservation specifically and environmental stewardship, it has to center, it has to center Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous approaches to conservation, because that's, again, just from a scientific perspective of what does the evidence show is actually effective for conservation, that's what the science says. And of course, I also think it's the right thing to do, but yeah, even if you're just trying to argue solely from a data perspective, I think the evidence to support that is really compelling. And so, yeah.
So in my coastal project in the South Coast, I collaborate with Southern First Nation. We use satellite image and also field surveys to investigate their ecosystem health on their land. So First Nations, they have their own knowledge and expertise for land management that's so helpful in the past few decades, long time. But with the technology, we can support their land management, such as remote sensing. It does not exist in history. So with remote sensing, we can see how their ecosystem, how their land changed over the time, and then we can provide information. So the fundings to support their First Nation land management. So I feel such still collaboration is helpful for the land management on the First Nations land.
I think in the hydrology community, the largest engagement and collaboration with Indigenous people has probably been around more recently the area of dam removal and the widespread destruction of salmon habitat in Western North America, and working with First Nations to take out many aging dams to bring fish back to different places. I don't think that the hydrology pure research community has done a very good job of involving Indigenous communities or centering Indigenous knowledge. It's not centered at our national meetings in a meaningful way. So there's a lot more that should be done.
Jesse, could you say a little bit more about the dam removal? Because I've been reading that it's way more prevalent in the US. Like we always sort of think we're like kind of maybe more socially responsible, but actually Canada, BC is really behind in dam removal.
Yeah, some of the largest ever dam removals are currently taking place in Northern California and Southern Oregon. And those dams, when they were put in, basically stopped the migration pathways of various salmonids into upper parts of the watershed. And then just recently, maybe I guess it's almost more than a decade ago now, the Elwha was the largest almost local dam that was removed on the Olympic Peninsula as well. Part of this is that the dams have become full of sediment anyways, and so they're no longer useful for storing water for irrigation, or there's challenges with hydropower. And so that timeline is now coming up with a desire to bring back salmon habitat. And so I think a lot of different parties that would normally not be working together are coming together to take out dams.
And do you see that as a land management practice that's going to spread to British Columbia?
I have not heard much about it, as much about it here.
So I asked, well, Sharon, I just want to shout out to Sharon Luck, who had the idea for this GeoFutures, and I think it's a really great idea, and also that we worked together to come up with the questions, but these have been our questions, so I'd be really interested in what the panel thinks are the important issues, not us non-experts.
I have one interesting technology ideas to share. So maybe you also noticed that robotics is kind of more popular in the past few years. So we are human geographer, physical geographer, even scientists. We mostly do some field service. It's not easy, labor intensive and costly. If we have robots to do the field survey for us, that would be so helpful. Yes, really save all time, save all energy and life. Yeah, it's coming, sure.
I mean, I think that thinking about, conservation, these questions also about carbon markets and whatnot. I think that like social scientists, well, I think that you know, in ecology and conservation science, we're kind of just starting to realize that conservation hasn't been working that well, and trying to understand why, and why is conservation falling short. And I think that social scientists have a lot of those answers. And so I think like we need to talk to the political ecologists out there more, and also think about ways that we can work together, which this is kind of what iBios is trying to do, but think about ways that we can work together to do conservation better, because I think the question is like why, you know, we have more and more better science, we have better models, we have better understanding of species at risk, we have, et cetera, but why are we still falling short? That's a challenge that I think also
Good insight, yeah.
Yeah. One thing I'll put forward is like a science question, and it's a multi-million-dollar management question as well, but it's which trees drink water that would otherwise support summer base flow in the summer? And so a huge question is how can we create more cold water for fish in the summer dry season? And I will admit that as ecohydrologists, we still don't know where all these trees are getting their water from below ground, which ones are directly pulling on the groundwater that feeds streams versus the unsaturated zone above, and how that all plays out. And so that's a big science knowledge gap, that's also a big management knowledge gap.
Super interesting question.
And then the other kind of like fun idea is like, this is, and back to the fire thing, is can insurance markets somehow incentivize different management practices? Like if you, many places if you try to go and get home insurance, they will say, we will not insure your house because you live in a fire prone area. This has happened to me before. And it's kind of like a shock. It's like, okay, so is there a way that actually there's market incentives to change land management practices to promote, I don't know, more resilient or less intense burning landscapes? I don't know.
That's really a burning question, and but it's really interesting because it's a very similar question to the how do you get flood insurance in some areas of Canada. And of course, in that case, in that instance, the federal government is moving in, and they're going to create floodplain maps and then subsidize insurance. So it may be that that's what we're ending up with, because as you've probably all seen, there are areas of California where you just can't get insurance anymore.
Which is the opposite of what the market should do if it wants to nudge people towards
right.
The subsidies are not.
The market is caring about itself, not about insuring individual homeowners. Yeah. So could we open up this panel to questions from the audience? Naomi, yeah. Go ahead.
All right, I was just going to ask, among the three of you, I'm just thinking, you know, the science of above ground vegetation and what's happening there that you do, Jane, and then the below ground stuff that you do, Jesse. And then Naomi, you use remote sensing too. And where do you think the interdisciplinary work needs to happen just among those, the kind of work that you three do to ground truth each other's science, and also to get at the mechanisms of what's going on, other than, you know, description of what trends, but the actual way to maybe change some of these mechanisms with land interventions? Just wondering, what is the state of the art hopeful science? Where could it go?
I think the approach of sort of, you know, intensive linking, I think we need better methods to link intensive field measurements with remote sensing at broad scales. I think that's sort of where there's a big gap. I think we're like learning a lot of, which I guess is really kind of what we're all trying to do. But yeah, you know, measure, yeah, there's no shortage of, well, there is a shortage. There's a shortage of intensive field data, but there, and we're in sort of, limited areas, and we get really intensive observations. We understand the mechanism of what's going on in this particular place really well, because we can do lots of instrumentation and lots of detailed measurements. But then how do you scale that up given the incredible amounts of natural variation that there is in the world? And at the same time, how do you take observations of big dynamics, big landscape scale dynamics of remote sensing and try to tease apart what's happening at that scale? I don't know, I don't have the solution to that, but I think probably, more conversations between scientists who are doing those different approaches is a good place to start.
Yeah, that's why I really like, just a quick comment.
Yeah.
So that's why I really like our event today, so we can just have some conversations, discuss each other's research, and explore potential research collaboration opportunities. So after I learn about Naomi Jesse's research, I can have a better idea how the remote sensing used in their research, and then I can provide ideas for them to explore, something like that. So conversations are very important. So to deal with some like interdisciplinary topic.
Thank you.
I think you hit it on the head with the conversations, yeah. Nick?
First off, thanks so much to all of you for some really great commentaries. Really, thanks for your time to do this. A couple of quick comments. Riffing off of the comment about insurance, we've seen this played out in a couple of different contexts. Like the whole province of Prince Edward Island, made some analytical visualization work we did a few years back, required viewing for insurance and real estate. And that's how they mobilized that entire province to actually change what they did. I also agree with the second point is I agree with the comment about indigenous knowledge systems, that not only, but we also need to be careful not to be our work and their work, right? It's not, we need to integrate. We need to integrate so that we are learning from those knowledge systems to inform our own, whether we call them models or not. And then the final thing I was just curious about, it's more of a question for you to comment on, is where do you think the frontiers are in each of your kinds of work where you might worry the most about generating false positives or false negatives in your work? Naomi, you were talking about your laser scanning in the forest, which I have some experience of myself, and I know it's a killer challenge to characterize it because you could scan an infinite number of times and still not capture the morphology of the environment you're trying to characterize. So I'm just curious, in each of the forms of your work, where do you feel that the places you're least sure of the signal of what you're commenting on exists in the methods you're using?
It's a good hard question. I mean, for me, it's probably when I start using remote sensing data where pixel scales are ridiculous. There are multiple hill slope units. We know that things are happening, and so when all of that gets merged into a spectral signature, we hope it's representative of what's happening.
Yeah.
That's probably not.
Yeah, so Nick, what you mentioned about false positive, false negative, that's really related to my remote sensing work, no matter for classification of different vegetation species, invasive native, or to evaluate ecosystem health. So we need model and also training data to do this research. So with, let's say, because limited funding, limited human resources, so we may not collect enough high quality data to train our model. And then no matter machine learning models or process-based models will generate some like false positive, false negative. So that being said, besides model development, we also can more input, more resources for the data collection. So which is one important way to deal with these such uncertainties in the research.
I think that's a great question, and I think for me, I think about cases where the answer is really scale dependent. So thinking about the relative importance of fire versus abiotic factors, soil variables for predicting the distribution of forests and savanna. At some scales, fire seems more important, and when you sort of zoom out, soil seems to be more important, and large scale climate gradients too. And so I think I'm starting to get to the point I work with partners in Cambodia who are doing a lot of forest management, and they're really interested in how, so they've been sort of defaulting to fire suppression, and they're interested in how can or should we be managing fires. So I'm getting to the point where I'm like maybe making some specific, giving some specific information that might be translated into fire management policy, and it's like, did I get the scale right for this particular application? Like, is the scale at which I tried to answer this question relevant to the way that they want to use the answer to this question in management?
Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you very much for these great contributions. So I'd like to ask whether you see all the fuzz around land as a climate mitigation strategy as an opportunity or risk in the first place for conservation and biodiversity, but then also on a more sort of meta level for research, right? Sort of, does it create new research opportunities, new opportunities for collaboration? So yeah, so it's a two-level question. So risk and opportunities for biodiversity and for research.
Yeah. So risk or opportunity really depends. I think it can be both depending on the context. I mean, I think, thinking about savannas, I think it's a huge risk. I think that there's the focus on carbon, and especially focus on above ground carbon, because we just don't know a lot about below ground carbon and how it changes with different management methods in savanna. But there's this risk where I mentioned that there's all this fire suppression to increase the carbon and woody biomass. I think that has a really negative impact on biodiversity. There's a lot of really cool charismatic plant species that are only found in the understories of these deciduous dipterocarp savannas. So you lose habitat for those, and a lot of wildlife also that depend on a mosaic. So I think it's a huge risk in that context. Where I think it's an opportunity is in terms of slowing deforestation. I think that first of all, I think reforestation is not a substitute for deforestation, and so I think when this focus on carbon increases the urgency of stopping deforestation, then I think that has a positive impact for biodiversity, and it's an opportunity in that case. But yes, I think it really depends. To be really like ecologist content about it. Yeah, and then do either of you have anything to add? I'm trying to think of an answer for the second part of the question about research. I mean, I think it presents, well, in terms of opportunities for research, I mean, the project that we're doing looking at impacts of fire suppression in the savanna is one of our sites. There is a RED project where they're suppressing fire because the people running the RED project decided that they should. And so we're monitoring. So that is helping us understand the importance of fire by looking at what happens when it's removed. So I think that creates an opportunity. But then of course there is the risk of our results, we are seeing that, oh wow, when you suppress fire in these systems, you get a lot more carbon really quickly. And so I do feel nervous about that result fueling more of this, what I think is, in my own personal opinion, is sort of not optimal management strategy for a lot of reasons. I also, there's been, to touch on the questions about indigenous sovereignty and human rights and all that. So where I work in Cambodia, there's been a lot of issues around RED projects and human rights violations, restricting access of indigenous people to their lands for the purpose of increasing carbon stored. And so I think there's that additional dimension, and I worry, sometimes I worry that some of our results showing how quickly woody encroachment happens in these savannas, because it's a really wet savanna. It takes a lot longer in African savanna when you suppress fire for trees to establish, but because it's quite wet there, and there is, you have really fast increase in carbon stored. But yeah, I worry that that's legitimizing, and I think that's one of the risks, legitimizing that. Is that gonna?
Yeah, absolutely. Jesse, how did you get into the carbon question?
Through puzzling. Part of it comes from a weathering question. So because the trees are injecting carbohydrates, and then that gets released as CO2, it acidifies the subsurface, and so that breaks down minerals. And so thinking about to what extent they're actually creating a deeper habitable substrate over geologic timescales is of interest. But we're measuring those carbon dioxide concentrations in the modern, and then also looking at the mineralogy and weathering patterns that record millennia of transformation, and trying to scratch our heads about how those two are interacting.
Wow. Big.
Yeah, sure. So my one part of my research is evaluate the impact of climate change. So to do that, we need long-term data, no matter fire data, biodiversity data, or vegetation ecosystem health. We need like maybe decades data, and then we can get some ideas how climate change influence the biodiversity, fire, or maybe the ecosystem health. So however, with the limited resource, limited team, or funding, and then that can limit our capacity to do such long-term research. So funding for 3 years, 5 years, and then sometimes other funding opportunities pop up, and then we switch a little bit to other projects. So that's not a really great way to investigate the climate change and its impacts on our land, our ecosystem. We need dedicated team, dedicated resources, and long-term research for that.
Yes, Rosemary.
Thanks, you guys. I'm always think whenever I hear scientists present, I'm like, so succinct. And I love the succinctness. It's just like, yes. So your presentations were all like so compelling and clear. And, I can't help but ask a question that I struggle with myself a lot, which is about like the implications of our research. And so the IPCC of biodiversity, IPBES, has said we need transformative change to address biodiversity loss. And I think you can argue, as my colleagues and I are trying to do in the IPBES assessment that we're working on, that some reforms can act as barriers to transformative change because they legitimize like the drivers of biodiversity loss, or they entrench a status quo that is itself implicated. Like, I guess I'm just like, because you do research, you make recommendations. A lot of the time, that's for like tinkering with insurance or land management practices. Do you ever worry that reinforces systems that need to be fundamentally transformed? I guess like that's my worry. Do you share it, or is it something that you think about when? And Jesse, you mentioned trying to figure out which trees drink summer water, and immediately I'm like, oh my god, now that they're just going to cut down all the trees that are not like the good water users. So what do you think about that, and how do you deal with it in your own research? I guess would be the existential, angsty question.
Yeah, it's a hard one. Like one of the trees that people love to hate on the most, where I've done a lot of work, is Douglas fir. And people talk about Doug firification as if and these Doug fir are these like weedy plants that are turning forests into monocultures and shading out more diverse things.
Wow.
I would say it's okay to worry about that, but for better or worse, I've never seen my work actually cited.
You can always fall back on that, right?
As far as I can tell, it has not had an impact. And so I don't know if it's a pragmatic worry that I should have, because it's pretty far on the like basic research side of things. But Naomi's work is probably a lot closer to being applied.
Maybe someday. I think about this a lot, and about sort of, I think it's also the question about working like within the system versus outside the system, right? And I don't know, I go back and forth honestly, if like, I need to somehow be, and this is maybe also what I think about in my own like personal life and politics and things like that, if I want to be advocating sort of burning it all down and like really this, transformative change that we need. And I have been, thinking with some people in iBios who have a project on sort of like how do we get conservation scientists who are definitely thinkers, right, to think more to think more boldly about like what's causing biodiversity loss, and can we therefore propose bolder solutions to biodiversity loss, or get behind bolder solutions to biodiversity loss. So yeah, but then at the same time, I'm maybe a little pessimistic about the likelihood of transformative change. And so in that sense, I feel like it's important to still kind of work within the system and do, you know, some of this tinkering to try to make things better if they're going to continue to be bad. So I guess trying to balance those two different approaches and do a little bit of both so that I feel like I can live with myself.
Same.
Yeah. Really hard question.
I like your question talking about the impact. So in maybe 5 years ago, my remote sensing research focused more on the modeling side. So try to publish more papers. So but in recent years, I try to kind of work more on application-based projects to collaborate with industry, with government, and then to generate something that can be utilized in the real world. So that's also why I have more like Medtex funding recently. So to collaborate with industry and then to work on the topics that of their interest, because they need those results to support their ongoing or future conservation management results. And then my research will generate more influence impacts on the real world management efforts. So kind of, but I also realize because they are the founder, so they have kind of focused topics which will some point limit our interest. So let's say we want to explore this direction, but so they want us to explore another direction. So that's kind of some trade-off. So yeah. So again, so we need both Medtex and the NSERC, so we can explore the same topic but from different directions, and then get a more clear, more comprehensive study of the ecosystem of the land process. Yeah, impacts.
Thank you.
More questions? Well, thank you all so much. That was just super interesting. And thank you, Sharon, for coming up with the plan, the idea, and I think that's been super interesting. So yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks.
That's great.